There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house after someone dies in it. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of presence rearranged. For 2 years after Gerald passed, I learned to live inside that quiet, to stop reaching for the coffee mug on his side of the cabinet, to sleep in the center of the bed instead of the left edge I'd claimed for 31 years. I learned the sounds of the house itself. The third stairs creak, the way the radiator clicked twice before it hissed, the particular resonance of rain against the kitchen window when the wind came from the northeast. My house on Aldercroft Street is not grand. It is a brick colonial with an east-facing front porch, a kitchen I renovated twice, and a backyard bordered by a low cedar fence that Gerald built the summer we turned 40. The neighborhood has changed around it. Newer families, taller fences, a coffee place on the corner where the hardware store used to be. But the house has stayed. I have stayed. In this city, in this specific grid of streets where I know which neighbors keep dogs and which ones keep secrets, I built a life that I was not finished living. I should say this plainly, I am 66 years old, I am in excellent health, I run 3 miles every Tuesday and Thursday, and I have more clarity of mind than most people I encounter. I mention this not for sympathy but for context. What happened to me happened not because I was frail, but because I owned something valuable and had no one looking out for me, no one except myself. Daniel called in late September, the way he always did, mid-afternoon, slightly distracted, the sound of traffic behind his voice as if the conversation was being folded into a commute. Mom, Aaron, and I have been talking. A pause I recognized as engineered. We're worried about you rattling around in that big house alone. It's 1,800 square feet, I said. Nobody rattles in 1,800 square feet. He laughed, but not warmly. You know what I mean. I said I did. I thanked him for thinking of me. I told him I was fine and asked about the grandchildren I didn't have yet, and we circled back around to nothing and hung up. But the call left a residue, the way certain conversations do. I stood in my kitchen afterward and looked out at the backyard, at the cedar fence graying at its posts, and I felt the first small displacement, not of anything physical, but of assumption. I had assumed my life here was settled, observed, and respected. I began, quietly, to question that. 6 weeks later, Daniel and Aaron came to stay for a long weekend. I made up the guest room with the good linens and put out the soaps Gerald's sister had given me years ago and never used. I cooked the lamb stew Daniel grew up on. I realize now, performing the role of competent, comfortable mother with the particular diligence of someone who has begun to sense she is being evaluated. Erin was pleasant. She always was, pleasant in a very thorough, seamless way, like a floor so well buffed you cannot find the grain. She complimented the house, walked through the rooms with an appreciative air that I only later identified as assessment. She asked about the basement, the second bathroom, whether the boiler had been serviced recently. She's an analyst, I reminded myself. She thinks about assets. It's professional. That weekend she also mentioned, twice, a place called Harborview Residences. A senior living community in the suburb where she and Daniel had recently bought their larger house. Independent living units, she said, pouring more wine with a gracious tilt of her wrist. They have a pool. Bridge nights. People your age who've made the same transition. What transition? I asked. She smiled. Into the next chapter. I nodded and changed the subject to whether they'd like eggs in the morning. The visits grew more frequent after that. One weekend a month became twice a month, and the stays extended, a Sunday night stretched into a Monday, then a Tuesday. I found myself adjusting my routines around their presence in a way I struggled to articulate as anything other than hospitality. Daniel began helping with things I hadn't asked for help with, the stuck drawer in the mudroom, the gutter he claimed was sagging on the north side. These were small acts of care that, examined individually, seemed genuinely loving. Examined together, they had the quality of evidence, a slow construction of the premise that the house was beyond me. Aaron began leaving catalogs on the kitchen table. Not Harborview specifically, that would have been too legible. Interior design catalogs, initially. Then one about downsizing and reimagining your space. A magazine featuring a smiling silver-haired woman in a sun-drenched apartment with the caption, "The Freedom of Less." I put them in the recycling. She'd find them and place them again, slightly farther from the edge, as if they'd been moved by accident. There is a particular kind of manipulation that operates entirely within the grammar of concern. Every sentence is defensible. Every action carries plausible warmth. What it produces is a slow accumulation of the message, "You are not managing," delivered through catalogs and repaired gutters and suggestions about pool access and bridge nights, until the message becomes ambient, part of the air of your own kitchen. I began keeping a small notebook. Not dramatic entries. Just dates and observations. Tuesday. Aaron moved the spare key from the hook inside the closet to the hook by the front door. Said nothing about it. Or Daniel mentioned, unprompted, that the house would be a lot to sell in a market like this. I had not mentioned selling. I wrote these things down with the same neutrality I used to apply to field notes when I worked as a research librarian, that forensic patience that Gerald used to tease me about. "You'd document your own dreams if you could," he said once, and kissed my temple. I missed him with a physical weight some days. I missed having someone in the house who was simply on my side without needing anything from the arrangement. The turning point arrived on a Thursday in February. Daniel and Aaron had been at the house since Saturday, a full week this time, ostensibly because Aaron was between project phases and needed a quieter environment to work. I gave her the study with the good lamp. I made coffee at 7. I accommodated. That Thursday I came home from my afternoon walk to find Daniel on the phone in the kitchen, standing with his back to the door, which he hadn't heard open. I was wearing my walking shoes, soft-soled, nearly silent on the hardwood. "Not like we can force it," the lawyer said. "The process takes time. She has to be assessed, and the assessment has to show." He stopped. Turned. His face arranged itself quickly, but not quickly enough. "Who are you talking to?" I asked. "Mark," he said. His college friend. A name deployed to close the question. I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed and held my hands in my lap and breathed. There are moments when you understand something fully and completely, and the understanding is so large that the body needs time to build the room for it. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes. Then I washed my face, changed my shoes, and came back down to make dinner. I did not ask again. I did not confront him. I had worked in research long enough to know that the person who asks the question they already know the answer to loses twice, once to the lie they'll receive, and once to the warning they'd just given. That night I lay awake and assembled what I knew. The phone call. The lawyer. Assessment. The Harborview catalogs. The gutter repairs and the drawer and the key moved to the front door for easier access. The long weekend stretching into weeks. Aaron's questions about the boiler, the basement, the second bathroom, the due diligence of someone pricing an acquisition. My house on Aldercroft Street, paid off entirely after Gerald's life insurance, assessed at $420,000 in the current market, was what this was about. Not my welfare. The inheritance they didn't want to wait for. I cried once, quietly, into my pillow. Then I made a plan. The first call I made was to Patricia Osei, my attorney. Specifically the woman who had handled Gerald's estate and who had once, over coffee, described elder law to me in terms I'd filed away the way you file away information about fires, hoping you'll never need it, knowing the world is not always cooperative. I explained what I'd heard. What I'd observed. The notebook's entries, which I read to her in the same even voice I'd used to deliver graduate library orientation to nervous freshmen. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Margaret, are you anywhere near your computer?" I was. She walked me through several documents, a durable power of attorney revision that would explicitly limit Daniel's authority, a health care directive that named my neighbor Claudette as secondary agent, and a letter she would draft to sit in my file, time-stamped, describing my clarity of mind and independent function as of this date. She also mentioned that while a guardianship assessment required professional evaluation, a person who demonstrated active, documented self-management was significantly more difficult to have committed to supervised care against their will. Documented, I said. Extensively, she said. The second call was to my doctor, Helen Farrow, who had been my physician for 14 years and who, when I explained the situation with the same forensic neutrality, was first silent and then quietly furious in the way that competent women of a certain generation are quietly furious, efficiently, and with follow-through. She scheduled me for a comprehensive cognitive and physical evaluation the following week and agreed to write a letter of status for my legal file. The third call was the one that required the most care. I called Claudette Beaumont, my neighbor across the street, who is 71, a retired judge, and the closest thing I have to a best friend. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is a rarer quality than people credit. When I finished, she said, "What do you need from me?" "Witnesses," I said. "Eventually." "When?" "I'll tell you when I'm ready." For the next 3 weeks I continued to behave exactly as I had before. I cooked. I gave Aaron the study. I let Daniel replace the porch light fixture he'd declared a fire hazard, which it was not. I listened to Harborview mentioned twice more with the same noncommittal nod, the same gracious sidestepping into a different topic. I was performing the role of comfortable, accommodating mother still. But now the performance was mine, not theirs, and the distinction sustained me in ways I hadn't expected. I also began spending more time on documentation. I organized my finances, 3 accounts, clearly labeled, regularly reconciled, printed statements filed by month. I wrote detailed notes about the house maintenance I had handled independently over the past 2 years. The boiler servicing in October, the plumber I'd called in July, the insurance renewal I'd negotiated down by switching to a different carrier. I kept receipts. I kept records of my running distances. I kept my notebook. Patricia had advised me, gently, that the most effective response to what appeared to be a developing legal and financial strategy was not confrontation but demonstration. A clear and documented record of competence that would make any assessment of incapacity essentially indefensible. The law, she explained, was not designed to be satisfied by the emotional claims of adult children. It required evidence. And so I would give the law exactly what it required, from the other direction. One evening I found Aaron at my desk, in the alcove off the living room. Looking through what I was almost certain were financial papers I'd left there deliberately slightly disorganized. She straightened when she heard me, and there was a half second before her expression reset. "Sorry," she said. "I was looking for a pen." The pen holder, where I keep 11 pens and have kept 11 pens since Gerald gave me the ceramic holder our first Christmas, was directly in front of her, in plain sight. "Of course," I said, and handed her one. I chose a Sunday in March for what I had come to think of, privately, as the lunch. I invited 8 people. Claudette. My doctor Helen, who agreed to come in a personal capacity. Patricia, who came as a friend, her business card in her jacket pocket, nothing more. My friend Rosalie, who had known me for 30 years and whose presence was the presence of my history, my continuity, my documented self. My neighbor Walter from 2 doors down, a retired accountant whose wife had gone to the same book club as mine for a decade. And 3 others, Diane from the library where I'd spent 22 years, and 2 women from my Tuesday running group. I told none of them, except Claudette and Patricia, exactly why they were there. I invited them to a late winter Sunday lunch, told them I wanted to see people I loved, which was entirely true. I invited Daniel and Aaron as well, of course. A little gathering, I said on the phone. "I want to introduce you to some of my people." Aaron said it sounded lovely. I spent Saturday preparing. The beef tenderloin I make for significant occasions, roasted with rosemary and a little Dijon. A potato gratin with Gruyere. Asparagus because it had finally appeared in the market. 2 bottles of a Bordeaux that Gerald's brother had given me for my birthday and that I'd been saving for something, and this, I decided, qualified. I set the table with the good linen and the wedding china and the crystal glasses that usually lived in the cabinet above the refrigerator. I put flowers in the center, white tulips, which I have always preferred for their clean geometry, their refusal of sentiment. The morning of, I dressed carefully. Not unusually carefully, I have always dressed well, it is a habit Gerald admired and one I kept after he was gone. But with the particular intentionality of someone who knows they are about to walk into a room where their presence will need to hold. People arrived at noon. The house filled with voices and the smell of the roast and the late winter sun cutting low and bright through the east windows, falling in rectangles across the wood floor the way it does only in March, only in the morning, a light so specific to this house and this season that I stood in it for a moment before greeting anyone and let myself feel it. Daniel and Aaron arrived last, slightly after the others. The room had already found its warmth by then. Claudette and Helen talking near the bookshelf, Walter and Rosalie in the armchairs, my running friends in the kitchen doorway being cheerfully instructed by Diane about a recipe they hadn't asked about. It was, genuinely, a lovely afternoon in my lovely house. I watched Daniel take it in. The people, the table, the flowers, the crystal. Something shifted behind his eyes, a recalibration that he managed smoothly enough, but I saw it. We sat to eat. I had placed him and Aaron across from Claudette and Patricia, which was not accidental. The conversation moved naturally, the neighborhood, the market, a recent exhibition at the art museum that Rosalie had seen twice. I poured wine. I told a story about Gerald building the cedar fence that made Rosalie laugh and made me feel, briefly and cleanly, his presence in the room. It was during dessert. A lemon tart I'd made from a recipe my mother left me, written on an index card in her handwriting that I keep in a laminated sleeve, that I began. I said, I want to say something while everyone is here, because these are the people who know me best, and I've been thinking lately about what it means to be known. The table quieted. Not dramatically, the way a table quiets when someone's tone changes, when the register drops just slightly from social to sincere. I've spent the past several weeks doing something I haven't done since I was a research librarian, I said. I've been compiling a record. Of my health, my finances, my home, my decisions. Not because I'm in any danger of losing any of those things, but because it seems that someone close to me has been building a case that I am. Erin reached for her water glass. Daniel was very still. I had an assessment done by Dr. Faro 3 weeks ago. I nodded toward Helen, who nodded back. Full cognitive and physical panel. I received the results on Tuesday. They were, as everyone in this room who knows me would expect, entirely within normal ranges. Excellent, in most categories. I said this without triumph. Factually. I also revised my legal documents with Patricia's help. Another nod toward Patricia. My affairs are in order, clearly designated, and on record. Mom, Daniel said, and his voice had that careful quality it takes on when he is buying time. I'm not finished, I said, gently. No one moved. I want to be honest with you, Daniel, because I love you and because honesty, even when it's uncomfortable, is a form of respect. I looked at him directly. I heard your phone call in February. I know that you spoke to a lawyer about an assessment process. I know about Harborview residences. And I know, I paused, not for effect, but because the next sentence cost me something, that this house, this specific house, is part of what makes that plan appealing. Erin set down her glass. Her face had gone very careful, very still, the face of someone running calculations. I don't say this to embarrass you, I said. I say it because I want you to understand, clearly, with all these people as witnesses, that I am well. I am capable. I am housed and managing and not going anywhere. And if there are further legal steps attempted in that direction, Patricia has documented everything I've just described, along with a letter from my physician, that will be on record and available. The table held its silence for a long moment. The radiator clicked twice and then hissed, right on schedule. Walter, to his credit, said nothing, just looked at his wine glass with the concentrated calm of a man who has sat through difficult board meetings and emerged having said nothing he later regretted. Claudette, who is a retired judge and therefore knows the weight of a room, leaned back slightly in her chair and let the silence do its work. It was Rosalie who finally spoke. "The tenderloin is extraordinary," she said, which was not a deflection, it was a mercy. An acknowledgement that the important thing had been said and did not need elaboration. The conversation resumed. Not easily at first, carefully, like people walking back onto ice that has just cracked and held. But it resumed. I poured more wine. I served the lemon tart. Daniel ate 2 pieces and did not look at Aaron and did not look at me for a long time, and when he finally did, his expression was not the one I'd feared, not cold, not calculating, but something younger and worse, ashamed. That was the moment I allowed myself to feel the grief of it. Not the anger. I'd had weeks for the anger, and the anger had metabolized into preparation, into Patricia's phone number on speed dial and Helen's letter in the file, and this afternoon, these flowers, this table set with Gerald's mother's china. The grief was different. The grief was for the version of my son I had assumed still existed, the one who would not do this, and for my own long refusal to see that people you love can become capable of things you would not have predicted. They left late afternoon, before the others. Daniel hugged me at the door, tightly, with the particular physical sincerity of someone who cannot yet find words. I let myself be held by him. I am his mother. That fact does not dissolve. I didn't think you knew, he said, quietly, his chin near my temple. I know, I said. I know you didn't. Aaron said goodbye with a grace I actually respected, even then. She is not a simple person. She had wanted something and had moved toward it with the tools she had. Those tools were wrong, they were wrong in ways she will have to find her own reckoning with, but I did not need her to perform remorse on my porch. I shook her hand. I thanked her for coming. I closed the door. The others stayed through early evening. Rosalie helped me with the dishes, which we did mostly without speaking, the way old friends do, the comfortable labor of putting things back in order. Claudette sat at the kitchen table and drank the last of the Bordeaux and told a story about a guardianship case she'd presided over decades ago, a woman whose children had done something similar, and how the woman had arrived at the courthouse in her best coat and testified with such exactitude that the case collapsed in an afternoon. She wore a hat, Claudette said. A good one. I've always thought the hat mattered. I thought about Gerald's mother, who never left the house without a hat and who had lived independently until she was 84, managing her own accounts and her own kitchen and her own particular version of the world. Helen left a folded note on the counter before she went, under the sugar bowl. I didn't read it until everyone had gone. It said, "Your numbers were genuinely excellent. The cognitive section especially. I thought you should hear that without it being documented anywhere. You are well, Margaret." He was wrong about that part. I held the note for a while. Then I put it in the cedar box on the dresser where I keep Gerald's watch and the ticket stub from the first concert we saw together in 1987 and a photograph of the house taken the summer we moved in, when the front porch was still painted white and there was a bicycle chained to the railing that belonged to the previous owner's child, and neither of us yet knew how long we would live there, how much of ourselves we would leave in the rooms. Spring came, as it does, indifferent to what had passed through winter. Daniel called in April. We talked about nothing significant for 20 minutes and then he said, carefully, "I want to understand something. Were you frightened? When you realized what we were, what I was considering?" I thought about it. "Not frightened," I said. Clarified. He was quiet. "That's fair," he said eventually. "That's more than fair. We haven't spoken about it again in those terms. I do not know whether we will. Families carry their histories in different configurations, sometimes like furniture, rearranged but present, still in the same rooms, sometimes like objects moved to storage, accessible but not daily. I am still working out which this will be. I am willing to work on it. Erin has not called. I did not expect her to. If she ever does, I will pick up. What I know now, in the way of clarity that tends to arrive after something has been survived, is this. The house was never only about money, even if money was its grammar. The house was about erasure, the comfortable, convenient reduction of a person to a burden to be managed, a liability to be transferred, a presence to be organized into absence. It happens to people every day, in versions large and small. It happens in the language of care, in catalogs left on kitchen tables, in keys moved from one hook to another, in the long slow construction of the premise that you are no longer the expert on your own life. The refusal of that erasure is not a dramatic act. It does not require shouting or scene-making or the satisfaction of watching someone crumble. It requires, mostly, the patience to document yourself. To know yourself. To understand, with quiet and absolute certainty, that you are the primary authority on your own experience, and to find the people, the professionals, the procedures that will put that certainty on record. The cedar fence in the backyard needs 2 new posts this summer. I've already called the lumber yard. I will do what Gerald would have done, which is take the measurements myself, order the correct wood, hire a person who knows fences, and supervise the installation with the focused attention of someone who has lived inside this particular 80 feet of boundary for 30 years and intends to live inside it for 30 more. The third stair still creaks. I've decided to leave it. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a house when you have fought for it and kept it. It is not the silence of emptiness or of presence rearranged. It is the quiet of a thing returned to itself, a room breathing normally again, a space that knows who it belongs to. I know it every morning when I come downstairs and the light falls through the east windows and the radiator runs through its small reliable ritual of clicks and sighs, and I stand in my kitchen in the house on Aldercroft Street and make coffee for one and listen to the neighborhood wake up around me. I am not going anywhere.